In October of 1929, the U.S. stock market dropped 68.9 points, or 23.05%, in just 2 days. This would come to mark the start of the Great Depression, a 10-year period that saw unprecedented levels of unemployment and poverty around the globe. Then, just as things seemed to be getting back to normal, the world was launched into its Second World War in under 30 years, even deadlier and more destructive than the first one. And while the end of the war was more than welcomed, it also served to mark the beginning of the Cold War, a period in which the threat of global annihilation was in the back of everybody's minds. It's no wonder then that for those born around the quarter-century mark, a generation that had spent their childhood wondering where their next meal would come from, and their early adulthood fighting fascism around the world, the American dream could be summed up in just one word: stability. The possibility of owning a home, knowing there'd be food on the table each night, and having at least a general sense of certainty for the near future was more than this generation could ask for. And in the 1950s, a new golden ticket emerged that easily turned this dream into a reality for millions of Americans: the white-collar 9-to-5 job. White-collar employment was safe work with a steady income stream and job security, something this generation's parents would have given anything to have. But over the past 7 decades, white-collar work has gone from coveted golden ticket to public enemy number one. It's pointed to as the source of many of society's ills, including depression, anxiety, high suicide rates, inequality, and overall life dissatisfaction. Social media has only amplified this sentiment, with countless iterations of fake gurus gathering legions of followers with one simple message: escape the 9-to-5. They preach to their followers that they are, quote, meant for something greater, implying the 9-to-5 is a wasteful way to spend one's life, something we settle for that will leave us feeling full of regret in the end. So how did we get here? How did the 9-to-5 go from a point of pride to being viewed as a mediocre life choice? Some would say the jobs are inherently soul-sucking and that they're designed to turn workers into lifeless drones. But I don't think that's the case. The real problem doesn't lie in the nature of the jobs themselves, but the way Americans in particular approach these jobs and the culture that has been built around them. To fully understand how we got here, we'll have to go way back to the 16th century. Martin Luther was a German priest who is best known for publishing his 95 Theses, a list of issues he had with the Roman Catholic Church, which has since come to symbolize the beginning of the Protestant Reformation. The Reformation was a period in which factions split away from the Catholic Church to form what would become the Protestant religions. Protestants felt that the teachings of the Roman Catholic Church had strayed from the word of the Bible, and therefore strayed from the word of God. They differed from the Catholics on many views, one of the important ones being the idea of predestination. The details of predestination are debated even amongst Protestants today, but in a nutshell, it's the belief that even before we are born, God has already decided which of us are eligible for heaven, called the elect, and which of us are destined for hell, called the non-elect. The Catholics believe that you work your way into heaven based on what you do in your lifetime. Protestants believe that no amount of earthly deeds can save you from hell if you have been designated as non-elect. As you can imagine, this caused quite a bit of anxiety amongst the Protestants. After all, how would you feel walking around every day, knowing you might be destined for hell, but not being able to do anything about it? Naturally, as is always the case with secrets, the Protestants simply couldn't stand not knowing. To ease their anxieties, they began to theorize that, although we cannot know our status for sure, there might be some hints. It was theorized that those amongst God's elect would be blessed with certain virtues the non-elect lacked. If you could display these virtues, you could rest assured knowing you were probably amongst the elect. Chief amongst these virtues? Hard work. Today, people assume hard work is an inherent virtue, but for most of human history, it was viewed in a more negative light. Ancient societies such as the Greeks and Hebrews simply viewed hard work as an unavoidable fact of life, and didn't ascribe any overly positive traits to the person who enjoyed it. The Hebrews called hard work a curse from God to punish for the sins of Adam and Eve, and Aristotle viewed it as a corrupt waste of time that would make a citizen's pursuit of virtue more difficult. With the Protestants, hard work for the first time became a virtue, as well as a way of reassuring them they were amongst the elect and eligible for heaven. The harder they worked, the more confident they became in their eternal destiny, and the better they felt. In 1620, 102 of these Protestants set sail from Europe in search of new land where they could practice their hard work and diligence undisturbed. They landed in present-day Massachusetts, founding a colony called Plymouth. These were the Pilgrims, some of the first settlers in what would become the United States. Protestants would continue arriving over the next decade, and in 1630 alone, 20,000 landed in New England. Even to this day, the United States is majority Protestant, with 43% of the population identifying as such. And although the Treaty of Tripoli, signed in 1797 by President John Adams, states, "The government of the United States is not, in any sense, founded on Christian religion," it's hard to believe that such a heavy Protestant contingent at the time of America's founding had no influence on its overall psyche. By the time the Treaty of Tripoli had been signed, the Protestant work ethic had spread throughout the population, so much so that it was now seen as an American value rather than a distinctly Protestant value. For the majority of American history, farming was the most common profession. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, as cities expanded and built upwards, blue-collar work began taking a share of the market. Hard work was inherent to these professions. These men came home bleeding, bruised, calloused, covered in soot, and exhausted. The nature of their work implied their capacity for hard work. Protestant or not, these workers could rest assured that they were amongst God's elect, or, as it had been internalized, amongst America's elect. This would all begin to change after World War II. Today, the 1950s is seen as a time of great stability, especially compared to the 1940s and 60s. But in reality, it was a time of radical social change. Along with the rise in suburban living came an increase in the number of college-educated people entering the workforce. This led to an increase in the number of people holding white-collar jobs. In the minority at first, white-collar jobs would come to dominate the American workforce by 1960. As a backlash to this social upheaval, many commenters claimed that white-collar work was making men lazy and passive, as well as effeminate. Compared to the blue-collar workers, men who had white-collar jobs had a cushy life, working indoors, out of the way of danger, far removed from the physical demands of blue-collar work. While the white-collar worker may or may not have believed this, there's likely one question he was forced to ask regarding his occupation. Where was the evidence of his hard work? Whereas the blue-collar man came home battered and bruised, the white-collar man came home clean and pressed, just as he had left in the morning. While he may have been tired, he was nowhere near as exhausted as the blue-collar man. And where the blue-collar man could step back and look at what he'd accomplished for the day, the white-collar man only had a stack of papers. In the mind of the white-collar man, a mind programmed by over 300 years of American Protestant work ethic, he could only by comparison be categorized as non-elect. Side by side, the blue-collar man was clearly the one possessing the virtue of hard work. Something needed to be done. The white-collar man needed to be sure of his value to society. But how? Over the next 70-plus years, the white-collar man developed methods of demonstrating his virtue, allowing him to stand up next to the blue-collar man and count himself amongst America's elect. Here are just a few of the methods used. Working longer hours. While it would be difficult for the white-collar man to exhaust himself through physical exertion in the workplace, working long hours could prove to be an effective method of achieving both physical and mental exhaustion by the end of the day. Americans work on average 1,687 hours per year. That's 435 more hours per year than Germany, one of the richest countries in Europe, 400 more than the UK, 365 more than France, and 169 more than Japan. This translates to Americans working about 4.25 more weeks than the Japanese each year, and nearly 11 more weeks than the Germans. Working outside of business hours. Being tethered to work outside of the physical office proved to be a great way of emphasizing the immense burden office work could have on a man. 7 in 10 Americans admit to answering work emails or messages after hours. The same number, 70%, say they're happy to answer these messages for reasons ranging from wanting to stay on top of work to hoping it will lead to career advancement opportunities in the future. Not using their vacation time. An estimated 55% of Americans don't use up all of their allotted vacation time each year. In 2018, 768 million vacation days went unused in America, with 236 million of these days being complete forfeitures, totaling $65.5 billion in lost benefits. This stat becomes even more shocking when you realize that America is the only OECD country in which 0 paid vacation days are mandated by the government. The standard issued vacation time in America's private sector is 2 weeks paid vacation per year, sometimes increasing with seniority, and somewhere around 10 sick or personal days. France, by comparison, guarantees 30 paid vacation days per year. Far from being outraged, this has become a source of pride for Americans. Foregoing vacation time sends the message that one would rather be at work than anywhere else. Additionally, it is sometimes used to convey that the worker is so needed at his company that any time off would lead to too much headache for those forced to fill in, as well as for the worker himself upon returning to the office. Constantly appearing busy and not taking breaks. Most Americans barely leave their desk for a bathroom break, let alone a coffee or lunch break. Only 1 in 5 Americans leaves their desk for a lunch break. 29% of Americans go the extra mile in demonstrating their devotion to work by skipping lunch altogether.
We wear our busyness as a badge of honor. We kind of also like to be seen as the person who's working right by their computer.
Adopting the martyr persona. The adoption of these strategies often ends up with the worker taking on the persona of the white-collar martyr. There aren't really any numbers on this one, but anybody who works in an office can attest to people adopting the martyr persona. Moving around a little faster than everybody else to show that they're busy. Always claiming they're overloaded with work, but never taking any help. Not trusting anybody with anything because only they can do it correctly. The martyr persona serves to emphasize a worker's importance to the company, and again, reinforce the worker's self-image as being essential and irreplaceable. These are but a few of the strategies employed by the white-collar man. And looking at the state of white-collar work today, we can conclude that this campaign has been a massive success. The image of the exhausted, overweight, unhappy individual who spends 9 hours a day at the office and answers emails at all hours of the night has become the accepted phenotype of the hardworking white-collar American. The human mind is a bizarre thing, often paying seemingly irrational prices to resolve any amount of cognitive dissonance. We stay in terrible relationships to avoid being alone, or succumb to destructive addictions to avoid dealing with past traumas. In the case of white-collar work, we've sacrificed our free time, bodies, relationships, and ultimately our lives, all to satisfy a need that no longer serves us. But it does look like things are starting to change. In 2020, many of us were forced to work from home, and began to realize just how absurd this white-collar culture has become. No longer having to commute, people suddenly found themselves having a little more time on their hands, and realized just how profoundly life-changing having even just a few extra hours per day could be. Some finally had time to exercise, while others spent time with their kids. People learned new skills or started side businesses. Many of us realized that getting even 1 extra hour of sleep per night could have a massive ripple effect on our mood, physical health, and productivity throughout the day. Seemingly overnight, it was revealed that these jobs themselves might not be the problem. Once they were stripped down, and people found themselves with more freedom, their jobs didn't seem half bad. When things started settling down and people were called back into the office, many flat out refused, either negotiating a work-from-home schedule or quitting and finding a more flexible company. People's eyes have been opened, and they aren't willing to go back to the old way of doing things. As always, many attribute this to an entire generation's laziness, or an unwillingness to work after receiving handouts. But in truth, many people just realized there was a better way of doing things. Companies letting their employees work from home for the first time did just fine, some even better. The notion that people need to spend more time working to benefit the company and society as a whole has simply become laughable. Economists such as John Stuart Mill and John Maynard Keynes once predicted that as technology progressed, people would soon find themselves with more free time than they knew what to do with. I don't know how close we are to that, but at least right now, things seem to be moving in the right direction.